June 8, 1943. The Mediterranean sun blazed mercilessly across the cobalt waters, its heat distorting the air above the ancient volcanic island of Pantelleria. 70 miles southwest of Sicily, this fortress had stood silent and defiant for centuries, its limestone cliffs now bristling with Italian coastal artillery and machine gun nests. In the suffocating hold of a weathered Sicilian fishing boat, an American agent named Vincent Scamperino carefully adjusted the frequency dial on his clandestine radio transmitter. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with dried fish and Mediterranean salt as he prepared to send a message that would change the course of warfare forever. The island before him appeared impregnable. German engineers had transformed Pantelleria into what Mussolini's propaganda called the Gibraltar of the Mediterranean. 160 coastal guns protected its harbors. Underground tunnels carved from volcanic rock housed ammunition depots and command centers. Italian Admiral Alberto Don had publicly declared that his garrison of 11,000 men could hold the island for 6 months against any Allied assault. What the Axis commanders did not realize was that their fortress was already under attack, not by shells or bombs, but by something far more insidious, the systematic manipulation of their own minds. The laughter echoed through the marble halls of the Italian Naval Ministry in Rome. Staff officers examined intercepted Allied radio transmissions with barely concealed amusement. American cowboys playing at espionage. The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, was dismissed as a collection of Wall Street bankers and Hollywood adventurers pretending to be soldiers. German intelligence reported that Allied special operations consisted of little more than parachuting amateur spies behind enemy lines with romantic notions of sabotage. The established European powers had been conducting intelligence warfare for centuries. What could these American upstarts possibly teach them about deception and psychological operations? Italian General Ettore Bastico scoffed at reports of unusual radioactivity around Pantelleria. His fortress was equipped with the most sophisticated communications equipment available to the Axis powers. German-manufactured radio direction finders could locate enemy transmissions within minutes. His garrison maintained constant contact with Rome through multiple redundant communication channels. The idea that a handful of Allied agents could somehow penetrate this carefully constructed defensive network struck him as absurd. The Americans, he assured his staff, were about to learn the difference between Hollywood fantasies and Mediterranean reality. Yet beneath this arrogance lay a more fundamental misunderstanding of how warfare itself was evolving. The commanders of Pantelleria thought in terms of concrete bunkers and steel artillery pieces. They measured defensive strength in millimeters of armor plating and tons of high explosive. But the young American intelligence officers preparing for Operation Corkscrew understood something their enemies had not yet grasped. In an age of global communications and industrial warfare, the human mind had become the ultimate battlefield. Every radio transmission, every telephone conversation, every written order now represented a potential weapon that could be turned against its user. The Office of Strategic Services had been established just 2 years earlier under the leadership of William Wild Bill Donovan, a decorated World War I veteran who understood that modern conflicts required new forms of warfare. Unlike the established intelligence services of Britain and Germany, the OSS recruited from universities, corporations, and research institutions. They combined academic expertise in psychology and communications with cutting-edge technology developed by American industry. Their agents carried miniaturized radio transmitters manufactured by companies that had previously made consumer electronics. They used voice recording techniques pioneered by Hollywood studios to create convincing audio deceptions. They applied insights from Madison Avenue advertising agencies to the science of propaganda and psychological manipulation. Vincent Scamperino represented this new breed of intelligence. Born in New York to Italian immigrants, he spoke fluent Italian with a perfect Sicilian accent. Before the war, he had worked as a radio engineer for NBC, developing broadcast equipment that could transmit clear signals across vast distances. The OSS had recruited him specifically for Operation Corkscrew because he understood both the technical aspects of radio communications and the cultural nuances that would make his deceptions believable to Italian defenders. His mission was unprecedented in the history of warfare: to convince an entire enemy garrison to surrender without firing a shot, using nothing but carefully crafted lies transmitted over their own communication network. The technical challenges were immense. Italian radio operators used specific call signs, authentication code, and transmission protocols that had been developed over months of operation. Any deviation from established procedures would immediately expose the deception. Scamperino and his team had spent weeks studying intercepted Italian communications, learning the speech patterns and operational vocabulary of individual radio operators. They constructed detailed maps of the enemy communications network, identifying key relay stations and command frequencies. They even analyzed the electrical characteristics of Italian radio equipment to ensure their fake transmissions would have the proper audio signature when received by enemy operators. Working alongside British Special Operations executive agents, the OSS team established a network of hidden transmitters across Sicily and southern Italy. These stations were designed to simulate the radio signature of legitimate Italian military units. By coordinating their broadcasts with bombing raids and naval movements, they could create the illusion of massive Allied forces moving into position around Pantelleria. The psychological impact would be devastating. Italian defenders would believe themselves surrounded by enemies who existed only in their imagination. Operation Corkscrew officially commenced on May 8, 1943, with a coordinated assault that would test every aspect of Allied military capability. The Royal Air Force launched the most intensive bombing campaign in Mediterranean theatre history, dropping over 6,000 tons of explosives on an island barely twice the size of Manhattan. American B-25 Mitchell bombers struck during daylight hours, while British Wellingtons continued the bombardment through the night. The constant thunder of exploding ordnance was intended not just to destroy military installations, but to shatter the psychological resolve of the Italian garrison. Yet the bombing alone was insufficient to guarantee victory. Intelligence reports indicated that Pantelleria's underground bunkers remained largely intact despite the massive aerial assault. Italian coastal artillery continued to operate, and radio intercepts suggested that morale among the defenders remained surprisingly high. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding the Allied forces preparing for the invasion of Sicily, needed absolute certainty that Pantelleria would fall quickly. Any prolonged resistance would delay the larger operation and potentially expose Allied invasion plans to German counterattack. The success of the entire Mediterranean strategy now depended on a handful of intelligence operatives armed with stolen radio equipment and carefully practiced Italian accents. The first OSS deception broadcasts began during the second week of May, transmitted from hidden locations across Sicily. Using captured Italian military codebooks and authentication procedures, Scamperino's team began issuing false orders to Pantelleria's garrison. These initial messages were deliberately subtle: requests for ammunition status report, routine administrative communications, and seemingly innocent inquiries about defensive preparations. The goal was to establish the credibility of the false radio network before attempting more ambitious deception. Italian radio operators on Pantelleria responded to these fake messages without suspicion, unknowingly confirming the effectiveness of the OSS penetration. Within days, the American agents had compiled detailed intelligence about the island's defensive capabilities, troop dispositions, and supply situation. More importantly, they had proven their ability to communicate directly with enemy forces using their own communication network. The psychological warfare campaign could now begin in earnest. The breakthrough came during the night of June 7th, when continuous Allied bombing temporarily disrupted Pantelleria's primary communications links with Rome. In the confusion that followed, OSS operators began transmitting a series of carefully coordinated deceptive messages designed to convince the Italian garrison that they had been abandoned by their high command. False radio reports suggested that Allied naval forces had cut all supply lines to the island. Fabricated intelligence summaries indicated that German reinforcements originally promised to Pantelleria had been diverted to defend Sicily against the expected invasion. Most devastatingly, the American agents began broadcasting fake surrender negotiations between fictional Italian commanders on other Mediterranean islands. These staged conversations, complete with authentic military terminology and emotional appeals to soldiers' families, painted a picture of collapsing Axis resistance throughout the region. Italian radio operators on Pantelleria, listening to what they believed were legitimate communications from neighboring garrisons, heard their fellow soldiers describing impossible odds and hopeless defensive positions. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. If experienced Italian officers elsewhere were considering surrender, perhaps continued resistance on Pantelleria was pointless. The masterpiece of OSS deception came in the form of a fabricated radio message, purporting to be from Admiral Alberto Don himself, transmitted using stolen authentication codes. and delivered in a voice that perfectly matched the admiral's known speech pattern. This fake communication ordered the Pantelleria garrison to conserve ammunition and prepare defensive positions for a prolonged siege, while simultaneously suggesting that no relief forces would be available for at least 8 weeks. The message was deliberately contradictory and demoralizing, designed to create the impression that even senior Italian commanders had lost confidence in their ability to hold the island. Italian defenders, who intercepted this fake transmission, faced an impossible psychological dilemma. If the message was genuine, they were being asked to hold an indefensible position without hope of relief or reinforcement. If the message was a forgery, it meant that Allied intelligence had penetrated their most secure communications network so thoroughly that no information could be trusted. Either interpretation led to the same conclusion. Their situation was hopeless, and continued resistance would serve no military purpose beyond ensuring their own destruction. The bombing campaign reached its crescendo during the first week of June, as Allied aircraft dropped over 1,500 tons of explosives on Pantelleria in a single day. The psychological effect of this massive bombardment was magnified by the OSS deception campaign, which had convinced many Italian defenders that they were facing not just air attack, but imminent invasion by overwhelming Allied ground forces. False radio reports described fictional Allied divisions massing in North Africa, supported by tank units and artillery batteries that existed only in the imagination of American intelligence operatives. British commando units played their own role in the psychological warfare campaign by conducting highly visible reconnaissance missions around Pantelleria's coastline. These operations were designed not to gather intelligence, but to create the impression of imminent amphibious assault. Italian lookouts reported enemy landing craft and reconnaissance teams at multiple locations around the island, not realizing that the same small British units were deliberately showing themselves at different points to create the illusion of much larger forces. Combined with the fake radio traffic describing massive Allied preparations, these visual deceptions convinced Italian commanders that invasion was both imminent and irresistible. The final phase of Operation Corkscrew demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of coordinated psychological warfare. On the morning of June 11th, as Allied bombers prepared for what would have been the final preparatory bombardment before invasion, white flags began appearing on Italian defensive posts throughout Pantelleria. The garrison, that had been confidently predicted to resist for 6 months, was surrendering after just 5 weeks of siege, and without a single Allied soldier setting foot on the island. Italian General Carlo Gotti, commander of Pantelleria's defences, later told Allied interrogator that he had made the decision to surrender based on his assessment that continued resistance was militarily futile. His communications with Rome had been effectively severed by the bombing campaign, leaving him with no clear orders or strategic guidance. Intelligence reports, many of them fabricated by OSS operatives, suggested that Allied invasion forces numbered in the tens of thousands and were supported by massive artillery and armor units. Most critically, he believed that other Italian garrisons throughout the Mediterranean had already surrendered or were actively negotiating capitulation agreements with Allied commanders. The reality was far different from General Gotti's perceptions. Allied forces preparing to invade Pantelleria numbered fewer than 3,000 men, primarily British commandos and specialized assault troops. The massive armor and artillery units described in intercepted radio communications existed only in carefully crafted OSS deceptions. Most of the surrender negotiations that had convinced Italian commanders of rapidly collapsing Axis resistance were elaborate fabrications broadcast by American agents using stolen radio equipment and authentic Italian military procedure. When Allied forces finally occupied Pantelleria on June 11th, they found a fortress that remained largely intact. Despite weeks of intensive bombing, underground bunkers and ammunition depots were still functional. Coastal artillery pieces showed damage, but could have continued operating for weeks or months with proper maintenance. Most critically, Italian defenders had possessed sufficient ammunition, food, and water to sustain a prolonged siege. The garrison that surrendered without firing a shot could have inflicted massive casualties on any attempted Allied invasion if they had chosen to resist. The success of Operation Corkscrew sent shockwaves through Axis intelligence services, who struggled to understand how an apparently impregnable fortress had fallen so quickly to what appeared to be conventional military pressure. German intelligence analysts spent months attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to Pantelleria's surrender, never realizing that the decisive battles had been fought not on the island's cliffs and beaches, but in the minds of Italian defenders who had been systematically deceived about their strategic situation. Post-war analysis revealed the sophisticated extent of OSS psychological operations during the Pantelleria campaign. American agents had monitored over 200 separate Italian radio frequencies, maintained continuous surveillance of enemy communications patterns, and successfully impersonated dozens of Italian officers and radio operators. They had created an entirely fictional military situation that convinced experienced Italian commanders to make strategic decisions based on information that existed only in carefully crafted deception. For the first time in military history, an enemy fortress had been conquered through pure psychological manipulation, without the need for costly ground assault or prolonged siege warfare. The implications extended far beyond a single Mediterranean island. Operation Corkscrew proved that modern warfare had evolved beyond traditional concepts of firepower and fortification. In an age of rapid communications and industrial production, the ability to control information flow and manipulate enemy perceptions had become as important as tanks, aircraft, or naval vessels. American industry was not just manufacturing weapons, it was producing new forms of warfare based on psychological insight and technological innovation. The lessons learned at Pantelleria influenced Allied strategy throughout the remainder of World War II. OSS psychological warfare techniques were refined and expanded for operations across Europe and the Pacific. The successful coordination of conventional military pressure with sophisticated deception campaigns became a standard element of Allied planning. Most importantly, the United States had demonstrated its ability to innovate new forms of warfare that combined American technological and industrial capabilities with insights drawn from academic research and corporate experience. German and Italian intelligence services attempted to develop countermeasures against Allied psychological warfare, but they faced fundamental disadvantages that reflected broader strategic realities. Axis communications networks relied heavily on centralized control and rigid hierarchical structures that made them vulnerable to deception operations designed to exploit those same organizational characteristics. Allied intelligence services, particularly the OSS, recruited extensively from universities and private industry, bringing together expertise in psychology, communications technology, and mass media that had no equivalent in more traditional intelligenceation. The fall of Pantelleria marked the beginning of the end for Italian resistance in the Mediterranean theatre. Within weeks, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, which proceeded far more smoothly than planners had dared hope. Italian garrison commanders throughout Sicily had learned of Pantelleria's sudden surrender and drew their own conclusions about the futility of resistance against Allied forces that appeared capable of conquering fortresses without even attempting direct assault. Many Sicilian positions surrendered with minimal resistance, accelerating the collapse of Italian defensive positions throughout the island. The psychological impact extended beyond military operations to influence Italian civilian morale and political stability. News of Pantelleria's bloodless surrender spread rapidly throughout Italy, despite efforts by fascist authorities to suppress information about the defeat. Italian civilians began to question their government's claims about the strategic situation and the likelihood of ultimate Axis victory. The fortress that was supposed to demonstrate Italian military prowess had instead become a symbol of vulnerabilities that extended throughout Mussolini's regime. For American military planners, Operation Corkscrew provided crucial insights into the changing nature of modern warfare. Industrial capacity and technological innovation were creating new forms of military power that could achieve strategic objectives previously requiring massive expenditures of manpower and material resources. The same scientific and engineering expertise that had built America's aircraft factories and electronics industry could be applied to the development of psychological warfare capabilities that were potentially as decisive as conventional weapons systems. The success also validated the OSS approach to intelligence operations, which emphasized adaptability, innovation, and the integration of diverse expertise rather than adherence to established institutional traditions. Vincent Scamperino and his team had accomplished their mission not through years of traditional espionage training, but by applying commercial radio engineering skills and academic insights about psychology and communications to military problems. This model of intelligence warfare would influence American strategic thinking for decades to come. The technical innovations developed for the Pantelleria operation pioneered methods that would be refined and expanded throughout the Cold War era. Miniaturized radio equipment, sophisticated audio recording, and playback system and coordinated multi-frequency deception campaigns became standard elements of American intelligence capability. The fundamental insight that enemy communications networks could be turned into weapons against their users influenced the development of electronic warfare and information operations that remain classified to this day. But perhaps the most significant lesson of Operation Corkscrew was its demonstration that warfare had become as much about industrial and intellectual capabilities as traditional military virtues. The Italian garrison of Pantelleria was defeated not by superior courage or better weapons, but by their inability to process and verify the information on which their strategic decisions were based. They had been overwhelmed by an enemy who understood that modern conflicts were fought simultaneously on multiple levels: physical, technological, psychological, and informational. The agents who planned and executed the deception campaign possessed no special military training or combat experience. They were radio engineers, linguists, psychologists, and corporate executives who had been recruited specifically because their civilian expertise could be adapted to military purposes. Their success represented the emergence of a new form of warfare that required not just industrial production capacity, but the ability to organize and deploy intellectual resources on a scale that matched the material requirements of modern military operations. Allied commanders preparing for the invasion of Europe recognized that the Pantelleria model could be scaled up for much larger operations. The same psychological warfare techniques that had convinced an Italian garrison to surrender could potentially be used to weaken German morale, disrupt Axis communications networks, and create strategic confusion that would facilitate Allied ground operations. The Office of Strategic Services began recruiting additional specialists in psychology, communications, and mass media, building an organizational infrastructure that could support deception campaigns across multiple theaters simultaneously. The fall of Pantelleria without a fight marked a turning point, not just in Mediterranean strategy, but in the fundamental nature of military conflict. For centuries, warfare had been primarily a contest of physical forces, armies, navies, and fortifications designed to control territory through the application of organized violence. But the emergence of global communications networks and industrial mass production had created new vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies who understood the psychological and informational dimensions of modern warfare. Italian and German intelligence services struggled to adapt to these new realities because their institutional structure and operational methods had been developed for earlier forms of conflict. They possessed extensive experience in traditional espionage and counterintelligence, but they lacked the interdisciplinary expertise and technological capabilities required for sophisticated psychological warfare campaigns. Their communication security procedures had been designed to prevent enemy forces from intercepting and decrypting military messages, but they provided no protection against deception operations that used authentic communication channels to deliver false information. The success of Operation Corkscrew also demonstrated the strategic advantages that democratic societies possessed in developing and implementing psychological warfare capability. The OSS recruited extensively from universities, research institutions, and private corporations that enjoyed intellectual freedom and encouraged innovative thinking. This decentralized approach to talent development created a pool of expertise that could be rapidly mobilized for military purposes without the institutional constraints that limited more centralized intelligence organizations. American agents who participated in the Pantelleria operation brought insights from fields ranging from experimental psychology to Madison Avenue advertising techniques. They understood mass communications, consumer behavior, and the industrial processes that supported modern lifestyle and economic activity. When these insights were applied to military intelligence problems, they created capabilities that had no equivalent in more traditional intelligence services that relied primarily on professional military officers and career intelligence specialists. The technological foundations of the deception campaign also reflected broader American advantages in industrial development and scientific research. The miniaturized radio equipment used by OSS agents had been developed by companies that produced consumer electronics for civilian markets before the war. The audio recording and playback systems that enabled convincing voice impersonations were based on techniques pioneered by Hollywood studios and commercial broadcasting networks. Even the psychological insights that guided the deception strategy drew from academic research conducted at American universities that maintained close relationships with government and military institutions. These advantages compounded throughout the war as American industrial capacity expanded and Allied intelligence services refined their psychological warfare techniques. The The same factories that produced aircraft, tanks, and naval vessels also manufactured increasingly sophisticated communications and electronic warfare equipment. The same research institutions that developed radar, sonar, and nuclear weapons also conducted studies in psychology, linguistics, and mass communications that supported intelligence operations around the world. By the summer of 1943, German intelligence analysts had begun to recognize that they were facing a new form of warfare that combined American industrial capabilities with intellectual resources that had been systematically mobilized for military purposes. Traditional concepts of military strength based on troop numbers, weapons production, and territorial control were proving inadequate for understanding conflicts that were simultaneously fought on physical, technological, and psychological battlefields. The broader strategic implications became clear as Allied forces moved from North Africa into Europe. Operations that had been planned as costly and prolonged campaigns were completed ahead of schedule with lower casualties than anticipated, largely because enemy resistance collapsed more quickly than traditional military analysis had predicted. Italian and German commanders found themselves making strategic decisions based on information that had been systematically manipulated by Allied intelligence services operating on scales and levels of sophistication that had been inconceivable just years earlier. The agents who transformed Pantelleria from an impregnable fortress into a surrendering garrison had proven that warfare itself was evolving beyond its traditional boundaries. What had begun as a limited operation to secure a single Mediterranean island had become a demonstration that American society possessed capabilities for waging and winning conflicts that extended far beyond conventional military measures. The Cowboy spies who had once been mocked by European intelligence professionals had revolutionized the nature of strategic competition itself. But the most profound lesson of Operation Corkscrew was not military or technological, but moral and political. The surrender of Pantelleria without a fight had been achieved through the systematic manipulation of enemy perceptions and beliefs. Italian defenders had made rational decisions based on information they believed to be accurate, not realizing that their understanding of their strategic situation had been carefully constructed by enemy intelligence operatives. In some sense, they had been defeated not by superior force, but by superior creativity and intellectual sophistication. This raised questions that would influence American strategic thinking for generations. What were the ethical boundaries of warfare in an age when enemies could be defeated through pure deception? How should democratic societies balance the practical advantages of psychological warfare against the moral principles that distinguish them from totalitarian adversaries? Could techniques that proved effective against foreign enemies be contained and controlled, or would they inevitably influence domestic, political, and social institutions? These questions remained unanswered as Allied forces prepared for the next phase of their Mediterranean campaign. But the success of Operation Corkscrew had established precedents that would shape military and intelligence operations for decades. The fortress that fell without a fight had become a symbol not just of Allied military capability, but of the emergence of new forms of power that would define the post-war. The men who had conquered Pantelleria through words and deception rather than bullets and bombs had proven that modern warfare required not just industrial might and military courage, but intellectual creativity and the ability to understand and manipulate the psychological foundations of enemy decision-making. They had shown that American society possessed resources for waging strategic competition that extended far beyond its traditional military and economic advantages. As the Mediterranean sun set over the conquered island on June 11, 1943, the fortress that had once symbolized Italian military prowess stood silent and surrendered. The guns that were meant to defend Gibraltar's counterpart had never fired a shot in anger. The garrison that was prepared to resist for half a year had lasted barely 5 weeks. The commanders who had mocked American cowboy spies had learned that in modern warfare, the most dangerous enemies were often those who understood that victory belonged not to the strongest, but to the most intelligent and adaptable. Did you know that a single fortress's surrender could change the entire course of a war? Today, as we reflect on the extraordinary tale of Pantelleria, we see how American ingenuity, industrial resilience, and psychological warfare combined to achieve what brute force could not. These men and women who served with such dedication and intelligence deserve to have their stories remembered and shared. If this account of courage and innovation moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with others who appreciate the untold stories of those who secured our freedom through their brilliance and sacrifice. Their legacy lives on in every generation that remembers their service and learns from their extraordinary example.